German philosopher Hegel once claimed that a philosopher is someone who is able to grasp their time and thought, which meant offering an explanation of the events leading up to the present as rational, unified, and therefore good. Art, along with philosophy, ought to be viewed as theodicy, methods of inquiry that help us appreciate the world as rational and well-ordered. A few decades later, Friedrich Nietzsche countered Hegel's model of the philosopher as historian by suggesting that the truly philosophically significant thinkers, those that play a world historical role in the development of thought, such as Socrates, were misplaced in their time and can only be appreciated retrospectively. Nietzsche and Twain likely saw themselves as outsiders of their own time, never quite fitting in, as if everyone else was privy to a script that they had never read. Both thinkers felt no need to reify flattering portraits of a community that they did not admire and did not recognize as their own. They offered alternative stories of the function and value of everyday social practices. In Nietzsche's case, it was moral vocabulary, the concepts of good and evil. In Twain's case, at least for present purposes, it is the necessity and virtue of deception. Twain was unique from his fellow citizens in that he did not lie to himself about the necessity, naturalness, and occasional benefits of lying. He wanted us to become better skilled and more appreciative at the art of deception, learning to wield its power for the benefit of others rather than ourselves. In a famous passage from the Chronicle of Young Satan, Twain suggests that laughter is particularly effective against dishonest actors, especially those well-versed in the art of lying. The devil asks Adam, quote, "Will a day come when the human race will detect the funniness of these juvenilities and laugh at them, and by laughing at them destroy them? For your race in its poverty has unquestionably one really effective weapon, laughter. Power, money, persuasion, supplication, persecution, these can laugh at a colossal humbug, push it a little, crowd it a little, weaken it a little, century by century, but only laughter can blow it to rags and atoms at a blast. Against the assault of laughter, nothing can stand." The question driving my lecture concerns the relationship between humbug and laughter, or more broadly, understanding both humbug and humor as tools that let us do things we can't do effectively with more honest forms of communication. I'll argue that Twain's views on lying, humbug, and humor suggest that he is a pluralist about language, that he recognizes language performs many different and legitimate functions for us in communication, in addition to describing what we believe or take to be true. Twain's pluralism also invites a model of humor as a tool we can use to do things we can't do effectively with straight-faced forms of communication. In the first section, I'll compare Harry Frankfurt and Twain on different forms of deception. In the second part, I'll sketch Twain's view of lies as social tools that allow us to convey impressions about ourselves, and more importantly, about others, and sometimes more effectively than stating what is true. In the final part, I offer a model of humor, following Twain's model of lying, as a tool which helps explain why humor is the most effective weapon against that pernicious form of deception called humbug or BS. Slide. Let us begin with the concept humbug, which isn't very common today, though the phenomenon I think it picks out is still common today. So we've shifted now the terms. It used to be called humbug, now it's called bullshit or BS. I assume much to Twain's dismay. In his seminal work on bullshit, Harry Frankfurt argued that bullshit is a blameworthy form of deception that is distinct from both lying and humbug. So that's part of the thing, is this connection on humbug. Humbug is a form of willful misrepresentation that is, quote, short of lying. So humbug is continuous with lying, but not identical to lying. So we need to be clear on what lying is before we can understand what humbug is. According to Frankfurt, lying is explicit deception, where the point is to convince your audience to adopt a patently false belief either about you or the world. A lie involves false declaration or assertion, something that is the case, but in this case something that truly isn't the case. In honest, open communication, the paradigmatic form of speech is to say something that you believe and that you take to be true and relevant to the topic at hand. To assert something is to undertake the commitment to it being true, for you having reason or justification in its favor. For me to claim that today is Thursday, I take myself to have evidence for it being true. And I'm also committed to yesterday being Wednesday and tomorrow being Friday. If I make this claim to someone who had good reasons for thinking that it was in fact Wednesday, they would be entitled to challenge or question me, asking, what did you mean? Today's Thursday. Don't you remember we had bowling league last night? An assertion makes a claim on how things are, thus making other ways in which the world might be incompatible with it. The speaker is accountable to defending their claims if it should so happen that conflicting evidence is revealed or brought to bear. But if I interpret what you say as poetic expression, sarcasm, or BS, then I won't treat what you say as factual, as something that ought to be justified by evidence or information. Something else is going on. On the traditional model, language is transparent, description of what is or what I think is true. Other forms of language are then defective or somehow inferior to this paradigmatic form of transparent speech. So then a lie is making a deliberately false assertion in the hopes that a target will adopt a false belief. It is an objectionable, defective misuse of language. For Frankfurt, lying isn't as bad as BS because it involves at least a concern for the truth because the liar needs to keep it hidden. But the lie has a soft underbelly that Twain helps us understand. The standards by which we are to evaluate a lie can be read off its surface. What I mean by this is if I claim that I was volunteering at the animal shelter last Tuesday, then you have enough information from that statement alone to investigate whether or not it is true. I have made myself vulnerable and open to challenge. Of course, being called out requires making a specific enough claim that someone else can identify this weakness in order to question it. If I keep things vague enough or avoid saying anything explicit at all, then my deception is less likely to be discovered. It might not be interpreted as factual altogether. This is where humbug has the upper hand. So unlike lying, Frankfurt proposes that humbug can take the form of both explicit word and implicit deed. It doesn't aim at causing the target to adopt a false belief, but aims to convey, in his case, a false impression. So the point of engaging in humbug is to convey this impression, not to give false information or evidence about the world. A paradigmatic case can be found in the actions of a politician. Political platforming, making grand platitudes about the gloriousness of the country or its adherence to the dreams of the founding fathers. Making a statement a politician doesn't intend for their audience to believe that the country is perfect or exactly as the founders hoped, but wants to be recognized as the sort of person who thinks that the country is admirable, or e.g. an admirable person. So humbug allows us to convey impressions without saying anything that holds us accountable to justifying or giving evidence or reasons for it being true. And it is this more pernicious form and unspecified form of deception that is exhibited in humbug that Twain takes to be most dangerous and for which humor is the most effective weapon. The Devil's endorsement suggests that humor can target humbug in a way that other forms of communication, deliberation, or persuasion cannot. For Frankfurt, humbug is a distinctly false impression, whereas BS involves a true or false impression. The bullshitter doesn't care about the relationship between the impression they want to convey and its truth. And for Frankfurt, that makes it even worse. So Frankfurt is what Twain might call a truth monger. He really cares about the relationship between language and truth and takes that relationship to be the factor that should matter when we evaluate what we say and do with language. Twain, on the other hand, is going to say it matters what we do, not what we say, and not its relation to the truth. So, for the purposes of this talk, I'm going to treat BS and humbug as interchangeable and take the target of the devil's declaration to be the form of deception that's involved in conveying an impression rather than stating a falsehood. And importantly, also, the benefits or the point of doing so. Slide. Okay, so consider again the devil's claim. A colossal humbug who is well versed in the art of conveying impressions or deception cannot be destroyed by traditional forms of persuasion. Politicians being a paradigmatic case. They want to make a good impression. So humbug and BS, as a disregard for the truth in order to make one look good in the eyes of another, attempts to secure the goods of a lie without the risks, without stating anything that would make you vulnerable to being discovered or challenged. So again, Frankfurt takes BS, humbug, and lying to all be blameworthy in virtue of the fact that they're inaccurate. Right? So that's one way in which Frankfurt and Twain are going to come apart. Frankfurt, like many philosophers, language particularly assumes that language necessarily or essentially performs this accuracy function. It describes what is true. And other forms of doing it, if language isn't doing that, then it's defective, something else is going on. We need to take a closer look. So, this mirrors the traditional model of lying as well. The liar deceives in order to save their own hide, not for others' sake. Although we can think of certain cases perhaps where the opposite is the case. I always think of the band song, The Long Black Veil, in which case a man refuses to give up his actual whereabouts in order to preserve the reputation of another man's wife. In such cases, the deception is not done for the deceiver's benefit, but for someone else. In fact, to the deceiver's detriment. Even Immanuel Kant, who I think Twain would recognize as an iron-souled truthmonger, if there ever was one, recognized the appropriateness of telling a white lie in order to save another person from embarrassment or shame. Such an act is a reflection of grace and respect for another person rather than cowardice or self-interest. And so we typically think of a lie done in preservation of self-interest or out of fear of retribution or punishment. Twain is pointing out that we also lie for other people's benefit, in many cases at the detriment of our own. Only a socially inept truthmonger, a proverbial Larry David, or an analytic philosopher would stubbornly maintain that the only way we do and should use language is to accurately describe our thoughts or our beliefs or what we take to be true, no matter the cost, even if it involves humiliating others for the sake of the truth. Twain, on the other hand, espouses the necessity and virtues of willful deception and warns against the dangers of dogmatism about truth. Twain's stance on humor in relation to humbug and his attitude toward lying suggests that he was a pluralist about language, that he recognized language was not always or primarily in the business of accurate description. According to Twain and other philosophical pragmatists, what matters is not what we are saying and its relation to the world or whatever we take to be the relevant truth-making features, but what we are doing. What we're doing when we use language is what matters, and once we take a step back to appreciate that we can do all sorts of different things with language, we can better appreciate these different roles rather than treating non-descriptive forms of speech as defective or necessarily blameworthily deceptive. Drink. So as the outsider within, Twain rejects the assumption that lying should be universally prohibited and that truth is necessarily more valuable than the untruth. Twain expressed disdain for universal prohibitions against lying and idioms claiming that the truth will always win out in the end. For Twain, these are inaccurate pictures of human language, of human nature. They were a lie about lying, a form of self-deception that also made us vulnerable to manipulation by liars and colossal humbugs. According to Twain, rather than accurate representation being the default norm of communication, it's actually the reverse. He says, quote, "Lying is universal. We all do it. Therefore, the wise thing is for us to diligently train ourselves to lie thoughtfully, judiciously, to lie with a good object and not an evil one, to lie for others' advantage and not for our own, to lie healingly, charitably, humanely, not cruelly, hurtly, maliciously, to lie gracefully and graciously, not awkwardly and clumsily, to lie firmly, frankly, squarely, with head erect, not haltingly, tortuously, as being ashamed of our high calling. Then shall we be rid of the rank and pestilent truth that is rotting the land. Then shall we be great and good and beautiful and worthy dwellers in a world where even benign nature habitually lies, except when she promises execrable weather." The assumption that a lie is a false assertion and thus universally prohibited follows from a view of language as essentially in the business of stating what is true. Right? Which then invites a model of lying. A lie is an explicit false statement. Right? So it sets us up to have an impoverished view of deception, of human communication, and the naturalness of deception. So it has this practical import to it. In his Essays on Lying, Twain offers a method for evaluating the ethics of lying and argues that we should evaluate lies according to their point rather than their accuracy. So again, it's not that they're false, it's that what we're doing with the falsehood that matters. Twain argues that, contrary to common sense, the majority lies are actually unspoken. implicit in our doings. He says, quote, almost all lies are acts, and speech has no part in them. It is possible for a person to, quote, convey deception and purposely with his hands, his feet, his eyes, his attitude. According to Twain, the most dangerous form of lying is what he termed the silent assertion. A paradigmatic example was the silent assertion that slavery was justified. People in the South asserted their endorsement of slavery in their everyday doings and what they did, even though they may never explicitly state that they agreed or endorsed it. They assented to slavery through their complacency and conformity, and the desire to avoid sticking out or causing a fuss then took precedent over their fellow humans. Similarly to the way you might think that Twain thinks that truth sometimes takes precedent over fellow humans. It is a feature of what Hannah Arendt called the banality of evil, that evil manifests in the tendency to treat atrocities as unexceptional for the sake of comfort. The beliefs that a lie is only a false statement and that language is always in the business of communicating what is true operates in a vicious feedback loop which allows people to avoid taking responsibility for the practical implications of what they do by retreating to the shallow surface of what they say or don't say. So the recognition of the ubiquity of deception is merely the first step in the art of lying for Mark Twain, learning to wield the tool for virtuous ends. The art of lying is something we have to develop, practice, and hone. It is a virtue. He says, quote, the lie is a virtue, a principle is eternal. The lie is recreation, a solace, a refuge in time and need. The fourth grace, the 10th muse, man's best and surest friend, is immortal. We need to practice the practical knowledge involved in the art of lying to learn how to wield the tool for good. Lying is woven into the social fabric of humanity, but it does not mean that all lies are created equal. Some forms of deception are neutral or even appropriate, if not obligatory, such as expressing joy or smiling at someone you do not know or feel any actual relationship or commitment or excitement about. Right? In smiling at a stranger, we act as if we know them, as if we care about them, even though that is factually inaccurate. The form of deception is socially appropriate, and it would be vicious to ignore them, nor a stranger who smiles at you. It would cause them unnecessary embarrassment or stigma. As Twain notes, it is a misleading reservation of an explanatory fact that you don't know this person. You express joy in encountering them, a lie, and you made that reservation, another lie, but don't be troubled, we all do it. Further, we rightfully avoid people who cannot keep their private thoughts to themselves. It's a matter of social decorum to recognize when and when it's appropriate to reveal what you think is true. So, according to Twain, the method for evaluating deception has to do with the point of it rather than its relationship to the truth or to accuracy. Right? And in that sense, we ought to wield untruths or lies or deception for good, for the good of other people, rather than for our own benefit. Right? So, to willfully deceive others with a more flattering picture that we ought not ever lie, and the only genuine lies are of the overt kind, we inhibit ourselves from developing a natural and necessary social skill, a social good. Adopting the truthmonger picture of language puts us at a disadvantage with those who are socially apt enough to recognize the necessity and virtues of deception, those colossal humbugs and the bullshitters. And rather than saying that, those they don't exist or they ought not exist. They do exist, they will exist. It's necessary that they exist. We ought to be prepared for it. Twain compels us to put others' well-being before that of some abstract, non-human authority called truth, thus in line with pragmatism. Humbug is conveying an impression, an indirect sentiment or statement or action isn't so much a silent assertion, because what it asserts is kept silent, because it's kept open-ended, vague enough to never be discovered. So Twain recognized that language served these multiple roles for us and could be used for both good and bad ends. I think his approach to lying suggests it isn't the deception, but the point or the purpose that matters. We ought to attend to what we are doing, not just what we are saying. Consequently, Twain's model of lying suggests as well that other functions of language, such as humor or joking, can be understood as a tool for doing things rather than merely a property of what is said, right? So if I say something that can't be true when it makes somebody laugh, and the property of it must be that it's funny, because it's not true. And the assumption is if it's the assumption is it's essential to language that it has a relation to the truth, and so then we are encouraged to explain humor as a property of certain sentences that aren't themselves true. That's sort of the background philosophy of language that's going on here. Okay, So traditional philosophical theories of humor take humor to be fundamentally psychological, a response paradigmatically exhibited in laughing. Humor can be philosophically perplexing because it isn't obvious or clear what we're doing when we tell the joke. Again, because it's not true, but we understand what's going on. Jokes, as one example, operate as quasi-assertions. They imitate everyday forms of speech, such as questions, narratives, hypotheticals, and observations, but we do not treat them as the same. For example, if we're at a party and I say, I could kill you right now, the fact that you don't grab the knife demonstrates you understand that I'm not being literal, right? Even if you do not laugh, because you didn't laugh. Like lying, I propose we understand humor as a function of language, a way in which language operates as a tool that lets us do things, communicate, and convey things that we couldn't do otherwise, such as demonstrate to a friend that they embarrassed me in a way that maintains our social bonds. Right? So saying, like, I could kill you right now is also kind of informing you, like, I don't like what you did, but at the same time, it's okay, right? So you can pack so much into that. Twain is well known for employing humor to reveal the practical hypocrisy in others' actions, attitudes, and practices, the ridiculousness of a self-professed Christian acting in ways that demonstrate disregard for the suffering and dignity of others. So again, it's about what is said versus what you demonstrate and what you do. But I think we ought to avoid reducing or defining Twain's humor as being any one thing. He uses humor to do many multiple things, just like the way he recognizes language does many multiple and beautiful things. So in that sense, I want to suggest his model of humor is akin to his model of lying, not a property of his style or sentences or of themes, but a strategy and a tool for doing things that we cannot do effectively with other, more factual tools of communication, such as description. On a pragmatist model, we're encouraged to take a step back and consider what some practice does for us that we couldn't do otherwise. This is to consider what humor does, how it functions as a tool, or as Twain suggests, a weapon. A tool is typically distinguished by its function, what it's made to do. So, what is humor made to do? It's a tool that lets us do things we couldn't do effectively in literal forms. We can pack much and display and convey and demonstrate many a practical and normative attitude without explaining or making explicit exactly what we think. Right? Successful humor doesn't need to be a reflection of what I actually believe or intend in order to make you laugh. Right? We can understand humor on Twain's model, akin to assertions and lying, as non-psychological. Right? It's not exactly what's happening in the brain of someone that's reading Huckleberry Finn that we're worried about here. And we can consider recent work in social psychology on humor as a tool for education. So-called instructional teasing can be an effective tool for reinforcing social and communal norms without explicit explanation, which brings with it both cognitive and social benefits. If I consider the saying, if you keep making that face, it'll stick that way. What exactly is going on here? It is an accurate statement. Instead, it's alerting or signaling to the child that what they're doing is inappropriate, without stating or explicitly explaining what rule they're breaking or what they should be doing instead. It functions like an imperative. Do not make that face. But covertly, right? The child has to be sensitive enough to the relevant social norms to discern the point of the tease. Instructional teases are thus active forms of instruction. They encourage the target to consider for themselves what they should or should not be doing, what is appropriate, and what licensed the tease in the first place. They also help children develop social and verbal skills, the art of lying, learning to not only discern a tease from an assertion, but learning to better handle and, in some cases, challenge teasing more broadly. Right. Instructional teasing has been observed in contexts where more subtle forms of instruction have failed, suggesting that humor can be more effective in cases where, again, explicit explanation is not. Slide. Another instance of humor as a social tool is found in the traditions of African Americans during slavery. Traditional psychological models posit that so-called black laughter is a coping mechanism, a way for enslaved people to express otherwise censored or prohibited attitudes and or cope with a harsh and dehumanizing situation. It's quite likely that humor played these roles as well. With the pluralism, we can appreciate how things do lots of different things at one time, and as well as increasing bonding between community members. But this is to overlook what humor does as an active element of human culture. Practices of sharing, modifying, and developing joke formats and tropes serve as a form of cultural production, transmission, and resistance. One well-known practice involved Trickster Tales. typically depicted an animal such as Brer Rabbit, using pranks and tricks to outsmart some purportedly more powerful or stronger predator. These tales were not offering factual information or testimony. They modeled tactics and skills necessary for navigating, surviving, and flourishing in the harsh demands of slavery. As sociologist Lawrence Levine has argued, trickster tales were sophisticated cultural tools. They served as protest stories in disguise and functioned to transmit important cultural knowledge without the risks associated with explicitly challenging the authorities. Like humbug, humor functions as a tool for conveying values while avoiding the risks of openly asserting them, thereby something. Obligates, because it isn't in the business of offering information or evidence. You should have been able to get that. Humor, humbug, the silent assertion, and BS are particularly sharp tools because they allow us to convey these values and attitudes without explicitly justifying or incurring the risks associated with demonstrating what we actually think is true. As such, the success does not depend on them being true. It isn't just that we're prone to using language in these ways that diverge, again, inferior or defective, it's that we need to acknowledge this before we can pay attention to what we're doing and why we do it. As Twain warns, anybody can tell lies. There's no merit in a mere lie. We must possess it. It must have art. It must exhibit a splendid and plausible and convincing probability. We should interpret Twain's endorsement of humor as a weapon and a virtue, of lying as a call to not only acknowledge but embrace the various functions of language and avoid restricting it to an ideal picture that places individuals at a communicative disadvantage. His model of humor offers us a strategy for doing what could not be done effectively with other more straightforward forms of speech. So I want to conclude by tying Twain's pluralism about language and his view of humor as a tool with his criticisms of brickbat culture. The form of education that is involved in the brute memorization of fixed sets of rules rather than the practical know-how involved in applying and working out these rules in various contexts. Just like Socrates, you can think of what Twain is arguing for here. What he presents us with is a picture in which we try to work out for ourselves what we take to be the reasons why or why not something should or should not be the case, instead of appealing to some principle or universal rule that does that sort of work for us. The bully is someone that wants to convey an impression about you, and the best defense is an offense, offering a humorous retort or dismissal rather than trying to explain why what they're saying isn't true. This is why perhaps the forms of speech are easier to get away with or harder to pin down. When challenged, the jokester can avoid accountability by saying they're just joking. The bullshitter can always say they're just BSing, which if taken to mean not asserting is actually trivial truth. And so it's unclear why they even need to say it. Once we let go of the myth that truth is the absolute authority over us and our fellow humans, then we're in a better position to appreciate why telling a lie or an untruth or a joke or a tease is not meant to be evaluated on the basis of its accuracy, but on whether or not it helps ourselves or other people. Thank you.